Hello, friends. A lot of times during my initial intake or my initial consultation with new clients, I hear a very common story, which is that over the course of the last several months or even over the course of the last several years, my spouse has been bullying me, so I don't file for a divorce. Well, we don't like bullies here, so we're going to discuss those issues and the different forms and types of bullying that occur and some of the resolutions to that bullying. Welcome back to the Divorce Broadcast. My name is Manny Segarra, coming to you from Miami, Florida. All right, as I just mentioned, bullying in a marriage can take many different forms, and it is considered abusive behavior. It is very important to note that not only is bullying someone into not getting a divorce wrong or unethical, it could also be illegal depending upon the specific circumstances of a particular case. So here are some ways how a spouse may attempt to bully another spouse into not getting a divorce. One of the most common attempts involves emotional manipulation. Specifically, an abusive spouse might use emotional manipulation to make the other spouse either feel guilty, perhaps responsible, or even fearful about ending the marriage via divorce. They could use such techniques as gaslighting. Gaslighting is when the abusive spouse, who's the bully, tries to make the victim doubt their own perception either about themselves or the situation. In addition to this, they may place excessive blame on the other spouse. Perhaps they blame the victim for all the problems in the relationship, or maybe even use emotional outbursts to create a sense of chaos and instability. Maybe there's arguments in public, maybe there's screaming matches. It's almost like a sense of the person who is getting bullied has to walk around on eggshells and also starts to doubt their very valid or genuine concerns and intentions at trying to get a divorce. So some of the ways to try to address or combat emotional manipulation in terms of a form of bullying. One of the best ways is to seek either therapy or individual counseling. I am a big believer in individual counseling to try to obtain the coping skills necessary to try to deal with the emotional stress and challenges of a divorce. Another great resource would be one of those divorce support groups. There are groups all over the country, whether they be local, where you can go in person, or now because of the pandemic, everybody's doing stuff on Zoom. So there are local support groups, either in person or online. They can provide a safe space for the victims of the emotional manipulation to kind of address and connect with others who may be going through the same type of situation. These divorce groups can offer emotional support, sometimes even really good advice as to how to deal with specific situations. Another great resource is books. The books or the podcasts online. There are numerous books written about the different divorce topics. A lot of these books offer guidance as to how to deal with divorces. And they also offer some insight on emotional healing and how to deal with the emotional manipulation. Another very common form of bullying is when the spouse, the abusive spouse, tries to isolate the victim or the spouse that is getting bullied from either their friends or their families. Maybe they monitor their calls. Maybe they don't let them go over to see their family and their friends as much. Maybe they don't let them see their friends and family at all. This in turn makes the victim spouse feel as though they have nowhere to turn to for purposes of either support or to confide in. As the isolation increases, what happens is that the victim's dependence on the abusive or bullying spouse starts to increase, and it makes it more difficult for the victim to get out of the situation. It's a really sad place to be. There are some ways to combat isolation. It is important to always try to keep family members and friends, especially the ones that are closest, in tuned and updated about the situation in the marriage, because it allows someone else to be informed, and it also leaves an ongoing journal of what it is that's happening for future reference in case either the police get involved or a divorce case is filed. Reaching out to friends and family can also provide emotional support especially for those that the person is most close with, because family and friends can offer objective advice. They are not in the situation, they are a little bit detached. Also, being able to talk through your emotions and feelings with somebody can allow the victim spouse to gain clarity about the situation and a better perspective. If friends and family are not available, perhaps speaking to members of the church, the synagogue, or the place of worship would be good. Some of the elders, some of the clergy, some of the people who are the leaders of the church. Reach out to them to see if there's any support groups there. Also, online forums that are dedicated to individuals who are going through a divorce, where you can post stuff as what's going on. This is a way to feel less isolated and a great way to combat when a bullying spouse is trying to isolate somebody. A big one is when the bullying spouse tries to use the children against the victim spouse. The abusive spouse might try to use the children as leverage, saying that they're going to take the children away from the other spouse, that they're going to manipulate the custody arrangement so that the other spouse doesn't have any visitation or time sharing with the children, to try to manipulate that spouse into staying in the marriage. This is one of the most emotional parts of these types of situations, but what's great about family courts is that the judges that are assigned to family court are usually very well versed and very well trained in the domestic violence issues, including the cycle of violence. And what's even better is that the judges take into account the children's best interest as paramount. There's going to be factors that the court will consider. Just because the abusive spouse or the spouse who's bullying the other says that things are going to be a certain way, I've seen many judges who are not in the least bit intimidated by bullies, because at the end of the day, the judge is the person who's in charge. The judge is going to look at each case differently, and they're going to consider the different factors that are set forth in each particular jurisdiction, the great majority of which account for instances of domestic violence. And I can tell you that in my experiences, judges frown gravely upon domestic violence, especially when it's in front of a kid. There may be a guardian ad litem involved in the case, which will also look at what's happening between the parties. Once again, I cannot try to impart as much as possible that the court will consider a time-sharing schedule that is in the best interest of the children, and it won't necessarily be what the bullying spouse is threatening that it will be. Now we're getting into another area, which is threats of either emotional abuse or physical threats. Obviously, an abusive spouse might use threats of either physical harm, harming themselves or harming the victim and their family, or even harming the victim's reputation in order to try to get them to stay. It could be forms of intimidation, which can include yelling, breaking things. There may be emotional abuse, which might include name calling, insults, attacking the victim's self-esteem, make them feel like they're trapped in the marriage. And then it can actually escalate to an even higher level of physical abuse. When these types of abusive conduct occur, it is so important for the victim to call the police, report it. We always post the domestic violence hotline number on these types of videos. We're going to do it again. When the police come out, talk to the police, get to a safe place, perhaps a domestic violence shelter. Also, they may want to consider getting a domestic violence injunction or restraining order. And finally, we have posted numerous videos regarding domestic violence and the issues that present themselves in custody and divorce cases when that appears in a case. Another type of abuse is financial control. The abusive spouse might control the family's finances, making the victim financially dependent upon that spouse and feeling as though they are unable to leave the marriage. The abusive spouse may threaten to cut off all finances so maybe they can't get gas, maybe they can't buy food for the kids. They may threaten that spouse by saying, if you go to court, you're not going to get anything. The judge is going to give me all the money. You're going to get stuck with all the debts. I'm going to kick you out of the house. You're going to be homeless. That's a big threat that I get a lot of clients saying to me, that they feel threatened that they're not going to get anything. Whenever someone tells me they are involved in that type of financial control situation by their spouse, I always try to articulate to them that in order to counteract that, remember that a lot of times in family court cases, the court will divide the property and the liabilities either equally or equitably depending upon where the jurisdiction is. So just by virtue of doing that, the spouse who's getting bullied should feel a little bit more comfortable that they're not going to have zero. In terms of getting kicked out of the house, I always remind clients that there is a standing order or a status quo order. Oftentimes requires everything to remain the same until there's a final order of divorce. So there are also exclusive use motions where someone may file a motion to allow them to stay there pending the divorce. If there's an injunction or domestic violence restraining order in place, and that spouse will usually get the house, especially if there's children. So it's not 100% doom and gloom. There is still hope if there is assets that the court will divide them equitably. Another issue that comes up is the cost of litigation. The issue is that the bullying spouse will say, well, you don't have any money, you're not going to be able to hire a lawyer, you're going to get screwed in the divorce. Well, this one's a little bit trickier. Remember that family court is a court of equity and will look at the need and the ability to pay. There may be an award of attorney's fees after the court divides the property if each spouse needs it. So there may be situations where the spouse who's getting bullied or the abused spouse may have to front legal bills in the beginning. Maybe they need to get a family member or a friend who can help them with the initial payments of the legal fees and the cost of litigation. But as the case goes on, perhaps they can get reimbursed at the end of the case by the other spouse if the other spouse earns more money or has more property. Unfortunately, in family court, there's no right to appointed counsel. So it's not like in criminal case where if you are a criminal defendant, if you can't afford an attorney, the Constitution requires that you be appointed an attorney. So that's why they have public defender's office. Family court is not like that. In family court, you have to pay for a private attorney. So that's a more difficult obstacle for spouses who don't have either control of the finances or the money to afford an attorney. They can proceed on their own. There's forms out there. There's in Florida, there's Florida Supreme Court forms. There's the self-help program in Miami-Dade County. There's legal aid. I know that CABA, the Cuban American Bar Association, offers assistance as well. However, in family court, you are not entitled to court-appointed counsel. All right, so before we wrap up, thought it would be important to try to give a little bit of support to those that feel trapped in their marriages because their spouse is bullying them. Realize that at the end of the day, if your case ends up in family court, it will be before a judge, and these judges, they don't take mess from anybody, and they really, above everybody, try to look out for the best interest of the children. So finding the courage to get a divorce can be an incredibly challenging and emotional process. So I'm hopeful that we at least were able to give some insight onto where some of the issues can kind of be addressed. Remember that it's also a very deeply personal decision to get a divorce. It's okay to have mixed emotions and uncertainties about it, but it is also very important to take the time to thoroughly evaluate the situation that each person is in, seeking support from friends and family, and making sure that the choices that you make are well informed, so that each person can navigate this process to the best of their abilities. So we hope this information was helpful. If you know anyone that is being bullied by a spouse, hopefully you can send them this video so that it'll point them in the right direction. Have them look us up at www.segarralawfirm.com. We have offices in Miami and Orlando, Florida. Se habla español. Please do us a favor and like this video and subscribe to the Divorce Broadcast. We'll see you soon. Thanks.